The day they finally told me I wasn't welcome anymore. It didn't come as a shout or an explosion. It came quietly, in the form of small cutting sentences spoken with the kind of casual cruelty that only people you love the most can deliver without hesitation. I remember standing near the kitchen counter, my hands still warm from washing dishes, when my son-in-law muttered under his breath, loud enough for me to hear, "She eats here but doesn't contribute." My daughter didn't correct him. She didn't even flinch. Instead, she folded her arms and added softly, as if giving a polite explanation, "Mom, you clean sometimes, but that's not enough. We're carrying everything." Her words sliced deeper than any knife I had ever held in my hands. I felt something inside me shrink, collapse like a small structure that had stood for years but finally gave in to its own weight. I wanted to remind them of the nights I cooked when my hands were so swollen I could barely grip the spoon, of the times I cleaned quietly while they slept in late, of the moments I cared for their children with a tenderness they rarely even noticed. But the words sat heavy in my throat, refusing to come out, because in that moment I realized the truth. They had already made up their minds about who I was to them now. A burden. A shadow in their home. A space taker. I stared at my daughter's face, searching for the little girl who once clung to my sorry, who begged me never to leave her alone, who used to whisper, "Mama, you're my whole world." But that child was gone, replaced by a woman whose eyes now looked through me rather than at me. And as I stood there, the clock ticking loudly in the background, the kitchen light buzzing faintly above us, I felt the distance between us stretch wider than the walls of that home. A painful reminder that the people you love most can forget your sacrifices long before they forget their grievances. I took a slow breath, steadying myself, trying to keep my voice from trembling as I whispered, "I never wanted to be a burden." But neither of them responded. They simply turned away, moving on with their evening, leaving me standing alone in the middle of the room, holding the weight of a lifetime of love that had suddenly been declared worthless. And in that terrible, quiet moment, I understood that sometimes heartbreak does not arrive as thunder. It arrives as silence, settling over your bones like cold ash. The next morning, the house felt different, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the hurtful words from the night before, and were now echoing them back at me in a cruel whisper. I moved quietly through the hallway, careful not to disturb anyone, even though I already knew my presence alone was enough to unsettle them. My daughter and her husband sat at the breakfast table, talking in low voices, their tone tight and businesslike, as if discussing a practical problem rather than a human being with feelings and history. When I stepped into the kitchen, both of them grew silent, exchanging a quick glance, one I had grown painfully accustomed to in recent months. It was the kind of look people give when something unwanted enters the room. "Morning," I said softly, trying to sound normal, but my daughter didn't respond. She only sipped her coffee and tapped her fingers impatiently on the table. Her husband cleared his throat, the sound sharp in the stillness. "We've been thinking," he began, and my heart immediately sank, "that maybe it's time we all had more space." That word, space, fell between us like a stone. I felt my breath hitch as I asked quietly, "Am I taking too much of it?" He shrugged, not even attempting to soften the blow. "It's just we have our routines, our schedules, our own lives. Having you here, it complicates things." I looked at my daughter then, hoping she would speak up, defend me, or at least soften the cruelty of his words. But she only stared down at her plate, pushing bits of scrambled egg around with her fork. Her silence was an answer in itself. Memories flooded me without warning. Nights I stayed awake massaging her feverish forehead. Days I worked double shifts so she could finish school without worrying about money. Years I held every piece of her life together with hands that never stopped trembling from exhaustion. And now here I was, being told that my existence was an inconvenience. "I don't want to make your life harder," I whispered, my voice barely audible. My daughter finally looked up, her eyes tired, her expression distant. "Mom, it's not about wanting you here or not wanting you here. It's just, you're not contributing. And things are tight. We can't carry everything." Contributing. As if my value had shrunk down to money or chores. As if decades of giving, sacrificing, loving meant nothing now that I was older and slower and no longer able to hold an entire world together with my bare hands. A sudden heaviness filled my chest, the kind that makes it hard to breathe, and I felt my throat tighten as I forced a nod. "I understand," I said, though every part of me was breaking. I turned away before they could see the tears forming in my eyes. I spent the rest of the day moving quietly from corner to corner, folding blankets, wiping countertops, picking up toys, not because it was expected of me now, but because I needed something to do with my hands before the weight of their rejection crushed what was left of my heart. And as evening fell, casting long shadows across the living room, I sat alone on the edge of my bed, staring at the small suitcase I had brought when they invited me into their home. I had thought it was temporary then, but I see now that everything about me had become temporary to them. My presence, my needs, my importance. And as I closed my eyes that night, I felt a truth settle deep inside me, heavy and unkind. Sometimes the people you love the most can make you feel the smallest in the world. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the house shifted in ways that were impossible to ignore, even if I tried my hardest to pretend otherwise. My daughter began speaking to me less, her sentences shorter, her tone clipped, as if every word exchange drained her energy. Her husband, once polite if not warm, no longer bothered with niceties. His sighs grew louder, his footsteps heavier, and his glances sharper, like he was silently counting down the days until I disappeared from their home. I could feel myself shrinking inside their space, becoming smaller with each passing sunrise, tiptoeing around their routines so I wouldn't be seen or worse, noticed. I cooked quietly, cleaned quietly, moved quietly, breathing only when I was sure no one would hear the sound of it. But no matter how softly I existed, I could still feel the weight of their unspoken resentment pressing against my chest. One evening while I was clearing the living room, I overheard them talking behind the half-closed kitchen door. "She's always here," my son-in-law said, irritation dripping from every syllable. "It feels like we can't live our own life." "I know," my daughter replied, her voice tired and low. "But what do you want me to do? She's my mother." "Yes, but she's also our responsibility now," he shot back sharply, as though the word responsibility were something foul tasting in his mouth. I froze, my hand still clutching the throw blanket I had been folding, a cold shiver running down my spine. I waited for my daughter to defend me, to remind him of everything I had done for her, to say even a single word that sounded like love, but instead she sighed, long and defeated. "I just wish things were different," she whispered. Those words pierced deeper than any accusation. I felt my heart twist painfully, realizing that she didn't wish for me to heal, or to be happier or to be safe. She simply wished I wasn't there, that I didn't exist in her home, that I didn't need her, that I hadn't become old. It struck me then how easily people forget the hands that once fed them, the arms that carried them, the sacrifices made in silence. Children grow up and believe independence means outgrowing the people who built their foundation. I stepped back slowly from the doorway before they noticed me, pressing a trembling hand over my chest to steady the ache spiraling through me. Later that night, when the house was quiet, I sat on the edge of my small bed, staring at my reflection in the dark window. I looked tired. Not the tired that sleep could fix, the tired that comes from years of giving until nothing is left for yourself. I wondered when I had become a burden instead of a blessing, when my presence turned from comfort to inconvenience. Tears slipped silently down my cheeks, warm trails on a face that had weathered storms far greater than this, yet somehow felt more fragile now than ever before. And as I lay down, pulling the blanket to my chin, a painful thought whispered through my mind like a cruel lullaby. Sometimes the people you sacrifice everything for grow into adults who do not remember the cost of your love. As the tension continued to thicken like a cold fog settling over every corner of the house, I began waking up earlier than usual just to avoid crossing paths with them, tiptoeing through the hallway with the quiet desperation of someone trying not to exist. Each morning I boiled water for tea, my hands trembling slightly as I held the cup, praying it wouldn't spill and give them one more reason to sigh at my presence. My daughter hardly spoke to me anymore. Even the simplest interactions felt rehearsed and forced, as if every word she offered was taken from a dwindling supply of patience. One afternoon, I found her sitting on the couch, her shoulders slumped, her face buried in her hands. For a moment, the mother in me rose instinctively. I stepped forward, wanting to comfort her, to ask what was wrong, to hold her the way I once did when she cried over scraped knees or broken friendships. But when she lifted her head and saw me standing there, her expression shifted from sadness to irritation in a single heartbeat. "Mom, can I please just have a minute alone?" she said sharply, wiping her eyes. I stepped back immediately, my heart sinking further into the hollow space inside my chest. As I turned away, I couldn't help but remember the countless minutes, no hours, days, years, I had given her throughout her life without ever asking for a moment to myself. Parenthood is like that. Unconditional, endless, and rarely reciprocated. Later that evening, as I folded laundry in the living room, her husband came home, tossing his keys on the table with a loud clatter. He looked at me with an expression I had come to recognize all too easily, an unspoken question of "Why are you still here?" He didn't even bother to hide his frustration. "We need to talk," he said to my daughter the moment she entered the room. They walked into the hallway, but the walls were thin, and their voices seeped into my ears whether I wanted them to or not. "She's been here for months," he whispered harshly. "It's too much. We don't have the space or the energy for this." My daughter's voice cracked slightly as she replied, "I know, but what am I supposed to do? She can't live alone anymore." "That doesn't mean she has to live here," he snapped. "We have our own life. We need privacy, freedom. This isn't working." Those words, privacy, freedom, landed like heavy stones in the pit of my stomach. I stood there, frozen, clutching a half-folded shirt as tears blurred my vision. I wasn't trying to take their freedom. I wasn't trying to intrude. I had come into their home because I had nowhere else to go, because old age had wrapped itself around me like an uninvited guest, slowing my steps and weakening my body. But now, hearing their whispers, I felt like a mistake they didn't know how to undo. When they returned to the room, their conversation abruptly stopped. My daughter's eyes darted away from mine, guilt flickering across her face for a brief moment before disappearing under a mask of practiced indifference. I wanted to tell her I understood. I wanted to relieve her of the burden of choosing between her husband and her mother. But an even deeper truth began to settle inside me. A cold, steady realization that perhaps she had already chosen. That night, lying in the darkness of the small room they had offered me temporarily, I stared at the shadowy outline of the suitcase I kept tucked under the bed. I had never fully unpacked it, as though some quiet part of me always knew this place was not a home, only a stop along the way. And as I closed my eyes, my heart aching with the weight of words spoken and unspoken, a thought echoed through me like a slow, painful heartbeat. Sometimes the hardest part of growing old is discovering that the people you once held closest now hold you at a distance. The next morning, I woke up before dawn, the quiet stillness of the house pressing against my ears like a reminder that I no longer belonged to the rhythm of this place. I moved slowly, careful not to make noise as I opened the window to let in a breath of cold air that stung my eyes awake. The truth of last night. The whispered conversation, the disappointment in my son-in-law's voice, the silence in my daughter's, clung to me like a weight I couldn't shake off. As I sat on the edge of the bed, I found myself thinking about all the homes I'd lived in throughout my life, all the rooms filled with laughter, arguments, meals, and moments that stitched a family together. Somehow, despite all of that, I had ended up here unwanted, unwelcomed, an obligation rather than a mother. When I finally stepped into the kitchen, they were already there, sitting across from each other with their breakfast untouched. My daughter looked up for a brief second, her eyes clouded with guilt, but she quickly glanced away as if she couldn't bear the heaviness between us. Her husband didn't even try to hide the frustration tightening his jaw. The silence was thick, suffocating, so I quietly poured myself a cup of tea, pretending not to notice the tension. But how could I not? The very air felt charged with the heaviness of being unwanted. As I held the warm cup between my hands, I caught my reflection in the dark window, an older woman with tired eyes, a woman who once ran a household, who cooked meals with love, who stayed awake through countless nights to comfort her children, who worked endlessly so they could rest. Now all that remained was a faint outline of someone who didn't seem to fit anywhere anymore. When my daughter finally spoke, her voice was soft, too soft, the kind of gentle tone someone uses when they're about to say something that hurts. "Mom, we need to figure something out," she began, her fingers fidgeting nervously with her mug. "This arrangement, it's not easy for us. We need our space." She didn't mention love or care or concern. Just space. Just difficulty. Just inconvenience. I felt the words sink into me slowly, painfully, like tiny shards of glass pressing deeper with every breath. I nodded, unable to trust my voice, afraid that if I spoke even a single word, tears would betray me. Her husband leaned back in his chair and added bluntly, "Maybe there's a program or a facility. Something that would be better for you. Somewhere you can get help. Somewhere you can get help." As if I were a burden too heavy for them to lift. As if I were a stranger who had overstayed her welcome. I thought of all the times I had lifted them. Emotionally, financially, physically, when they were small, fragile, helpless. I thought of how freely I had given everything, never imagining a day would come when I would be gently pushed away like clutter taking up space. The room blurred slightly as my eyes welled, but I blinked quickly, swallowing back the ache that rose in my throat. I didn't want pity. I didn't want to argue. I didn't want to beg to stay. So I simply whispered, "I understand," even though every part of me shattered with the lie. They both seemed relieved, the tension easing from their shoulders as though I had solved a problem for them with just those 2 words. After a moment I stood up, steadying myself on the table, and walked back to my room. The hallway felt longer than ever, as though each step pulled me further away from the life I once knew. When I closed the door behind me, the silence inside swallowed me whole. For the first time in years I felt truly painfully alone, not because there was no one around but because the people around me no longer saw me as someone worth holding on to. That afternoon, after hours of sitting alone in my room staring at the faded pattern on the curtains, I decided to step outside for a walk. Not because my body had the energy for it, but because my heart needed air. As I stepped out into the cool breeze, the world felt strangely distant, as though I were walking through a memory rather than a living moment. I wandered down the street slowly, each step a reminder of how my knees ached now, how time had carved its marks on me without mercy. People passed by in hurried strides, busy, purposeful, unaware of the quiet storm unfolding inside me. I found a small bench near the park and sat for a long time, watching children laugh as they played, their mothers calling after them with warm voices filled with love. That sound once belonged to me, too. I remembered calling my daughter's name across a playground just like this, chasing after her with a smile, wiping her tears when she fell, brushing dust off her clothes while telling her she was brave. She used to cling to my hand then, trusting me completely, believing I could fix anything. Now, years later, I could barely hold on to her attention. As I sat there, a thought unfolded quietly inside me. People don't stop loving intentionally. Sometimes they just grow into new lives where you don't fit the same anymore. But knowing that didn't make the ache any easier to bear. The wind carried the scent of grass and distant food carts, stirring old memories of evenings spent cooking for my family, filling our home with warmth and laughter. I wondered when exactly that warmth had left, when the laughter had turned into whispers, when home had become a place where I walked on eggshells, afraid to breathe too loudly. After a while, I stood up and walked toward a small cafe I used to adore, hoping a familiar taste might bring me some comfort. I stood by the counter, fumbling for my wallet, suddenly realizing I hadn't brought it. The young cashier smiled politely, unaware of the panic rising in me. Before embarrassment could swallow me whole, a woman in line behind me gently tapped my shoulder and said, "It's okay, I've got it." Her voice was so kind that my eyes stung instantly. I thanked her with a trembling smile and took the warm cup she paid for. As I stepped outside again, Clutching the coffee like a fragile gift, a deep truth settled within me. Sometimes compassion comes from strangers, while hurt comes from those closest to us. On the way back home, the sky had begun turning a dull shade of gray, reflecting the heaviness inside me. I walked slower, not because my legs demanded it, but because I feared returning to that house, to those conversations, to the reality that awaited me there. When I finally reached the doorstep, I paused, my hand hovering over the doorknob. I suddenly felt like an outsider standing at a place that should have felt like refuge, but instead felt like a reminder of all I had lost. I took a deep breath and opened the door quietly. The silence inside greeted me first, cold, distant, unforgiving. They were in the living room, talking softly again, and their voices stopped the moment I walked in. That silence, heavy and pointed, told me more than any words ever could. I realized then that the question was no longer whether they wanted me there. The question was whether I could keep breaking a little more every day just to stay. That night, long after everyone had gone to bed, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, tracing the faint cracks as if they held answers to questions I had been afraid to ask myself. The house was silent, but inside my chest a storm raged. Memories colliding with present pain, love wrestling with the harsh truth of being unwanted. I kept replaying every moment of the past few days, every whispered conversation, every averted gaze, every sigh that carried the weight of unspoken resentment. It felt like watching the unraveling of a life I had spent decades building with my own hands. Eventually, the heaviness became too much to contain. I quietly slipped out of bed and opened my suitcase, the same suitcase I had never fully unpacked because some part of me always feared this day would come. Inside were pieces of my life. A sweater my daughter once bought me for Mother's Day. A framed photo of all of us smiling during a vacation we couldn't afford but somehow made unforgettable. Letters I had written but never sent. As I touched each item, tears blurred my vision, falling silently onto the fabric like tiny confessions of a heart breaking in slow motion. I realized then that staying in that house meant slowly dissolving into someone they didn't recognize anymore. Someone they didn't care to understand. Leaving, however, meant stepping into an unknown full of loneliness and uncertainty. But pain has a way of guiding you toward choices you never imagined making. With trembling hands, I began folding my few belongings neatly, quietly, methodically, almost ritualistically. Every folded shirt felt like closing a chapter. Every zipped pocket felt like sealing away a piece of myself I could no longer share with them. When I finished, I sat on the edge of the bed and watched the shadows shift across the room as the moonlight filtered through the thin curtains. I thought about my daughter, about the little girl who once clung to my hand, who believed I could chase away monsters, who used to search for me first whenever she was scared. Somewhere along the way, that little girl had grown up and I had simply grown old. The distance between us wasn't made of anger or cruelty. It was made of time. Time that had moved too fast for me and too far for her. And perhaps that was the most painful truth of all. Nobody meant to hurt anyone, but hurt happened anyway. As the clock ticked softly in the hallway, I whispered a quiet goodbye to a home that wasn't mine anymore. I wasn't running away out of spite. I was leaving because staying meant losing the last fragile pieces of myself. I wiped my tears, steadied my breathing, and made a promise deep in my heart. One last promise to myself, that whatever waited for me outside the walls of this house, I would face it with dignity. I deserved at least that much. Even if they didn't see my worth, I had to remember it for myself. And as I lay back down, suitcase ready by the door, one thought echoed through me like a final fragile heartbeat. Sometimes choosing yourself is the only way to survive the people you love. Before the sun even began to rise, I quietly slipped out of bed, my heart trembling with both fear and determination. The house was still asleep, wrapped in the kind of silence that doesn't comfort, it suffocates. I picked up my suitcase, feeling its weight not just in my hands but in my soul, because it carried the last pieces of a life I had spent years building and the painful truth that I was walking away from people who once promised I would never be alone. As I walked through the dim hallway, I paused outside my daughter's door, listening to the soft rhythm of her breathing. For a moment I imagined opening the door, holding her one last time, whispering that I loved her no matter what. But love, I realized, isn't always enough to keep someone close, especially when they've already drifted far away. So I stepped back, letting the moment dissolve into the shadows. When I reached the front door, the cool metal of the handle felt strangely steady under my shaking fingers. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the faint scent of the house, coffee, detergent, and something familiar that once meant home but now felt like a memory I could no longer live inside. As I stepped out into the early morning air, the world was washed in a soft blue light, quiet and untouched, as though it was giving me permission to begin again. The street was empty, save for a few flickering street lamps, and the silence outside felt kinder than the silence inside ever had. I stood there for a moment, clutching my suitcase tightly, letting the cold breeze brush against my face, grounding me, reminding me that I was still here, that I still mattered. With slow, steady steps, I began walking, not knowing exactly where I was going but knowing I couldn't stay. Every step felt like shedding a layer of hurt, a small reclaiming of the dignity I had slowly lost inside those walls. As I reached the corner of the street, I turned back one last time. The house looked peaceful from the outside, almost beautiful, as if it had nothing to do with the sorrow it contained. And maybe that was the point. Sometimes the places we leave behind don't change, but we do. I whispered a soft goodbye, not out of bitterness but out of acceptance. I wasn't abandoning them, and they weren't villains in my story. We had simply reached a parting point where staying meant breaking, and leaving meant healing little by little, day by day. As the first rays of dawn stretched across the sky, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. The faint, fragile spark of hope. Maybe I would find a small apartment somewhere. Maybe I would join a community center. Maybe I would meet people who didn't see me as a burden, but as a person with stories, memories, and worth. Maybe, for the first time in years, I would live for myself. And as I walked into the morning light, carrying nothing but a suitcase and a heart held together by quiet strength, I realized that this wasn't an ending. It was a beginning I had never imagined I'd have the courage to choose.